The geopolitical landscape shifted on its axis as December 2025 drew to a close, marked by the high-stakes summit at Mar-a-Lago between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelenskyy. This meeting was not merely a diplomatic formality, but a desperate attempt to bridge the gap between two radically different visions of peace. For nearly 4 years, the war had ground through the soil of Eastern Europe, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives and draining global treasuries. Now, the rhetoric of total victory had been replaced by the cold calculations of a negotiated settlement. Zelenskyy arrived in Florida aware that the leverage of the past was gone. Trump, fueled by a mandate to end foreign entanglements, demanded a definitive roadmap for de-escalation. The discussions were described as intense and blunt, reflecting the urgency of a conflict that threatened to spiral into a broader continental war. As the leaders emerged from behind closed doors, the world watched for any sign of alignment. What followed was a series of revelations regarding security guarantees that would have been unthinkable just months prior. The core of these talks centered on a singular, explosive concept: the physical presence of American boots on Ukrainian soil as a shield against future Russian aggression. In a move that stunned both Brussels and Moscow, President Zelenskyy confirmed via official channels that the deployment of United States troops was now a primary topic of negotiation. This proposal represents a fundamental pivot from the previous administration's policy of avoiding direct military involvement. Zelenskyy argued that for any ceasefire to hold, there must be a tangible deterrent that Vladimir Putin cannot ignore. The Ukrainian leader believes that only the American flag can provide the psychological and military weight necessary to prevent a renewed Russian offensive once the guns fall silent. These troops would not be intended for frontline combat, but would serve as a tripwire force stationed at strategic hubs and along the eventual line of contact. The logic is simple yet perilous. Any Russian strike on these positions would be an attack on the United States itself. While Trump has historically been wary of such commitments, he has reportedly entertained the idea as a means to secure a final deal that allows for a swift American exit from the broader funding of the war. The debate now focuses on whether this deployment would be unilateral or part of a larger multinational coalition that includes several European allies. The diplomatic machinery is currently churning to build what is being called a coalition of the willing, a group of over 30 nations prepared to enforce the peace. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk has emerged as a central figure in these deliberations, suggesting that European nations must shoulder the heavy lifting of peacekeeping. According to the emerging framework, while the United States might provide the command structure and a symbolic troop presence, countries like Poland, the United Kingdom, and Germany would provide the bulk of the personnel. This coalition is intended to occupy a demilitarized zone, creating a physical buffer between the two warring armies. For Zelenskyy, this internationalization of the border is the only way to ensure that Ukraine does not become a permanent gray zone of instability. However, the logistics of such an operation are staggering. It requires a level of coordination between NATO members and non-NATO allies that has rarely been seen. Trump has signaled that the financial burden of this mission must fall on Europe, asserting that the United States has already contributed its fair share. The upcoming meeting in Kyiv on January 3rd will be the first major test of this collective resolve and military readiness. As peace talks reached a fever pitch, a sudden and dangerous accusation from the Kremlin threatened to derail the entire process. Russian officials claimed that Ukraine had launched a drone strike targeting President Putin's private residence in Valdai. This allegation was immediately seized upon by Moscow as proof that Kyiv was not interested in peace, but in assassination and escalation. In his discussions with Trump, Zelenskyy was forced to spend significant time debunking these claims, calling them a complete fabrication and a typical Russian lie. The timing of the Russian claim appeared calculated to sow doubt in Trump's mind just as he was nearing a deal. Trump initially reacted with visible anger to the news of the alleged strike, reflecting his sensitivity to actions that could sabotage his peacemaker image. Ukraine's intelligence services have since provided the American transition team with what they call irrefutable evidence that the incident was a false flag operation. This war of narratives highlights the extreme fragility of the trust between the parties involved. Every step toward a settlement is met with a countermove of disinformation designed to keep the situation volatile and the negotiators on edge for many weeks to come. The path to a ceasefire is currently blocked by two competing documents that offer vastly different visions of the future. The first is a 27-point plan that Trump reportedly discussed with Putin during their Alaska summit in August. This plan is said to be more favorable to Russian interests, potentially including the formal recognition of certain territorial gains and the lifting of various sanctions. The second is a 20-point plan developed in coordination with the Ukrainian government. This version emphasizes the restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty over critical infrastructure, specifically the Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant, and provides a clear timeline for the withdrawal of Russian forces from occupied areas. The tension between these two plans is the primary source of friction in the current negotiations. Trump has claimed that the two sides are 95% of the way there, but that final 5% contains the most explosive issues. Zelensky's task is to ensure that the final agreement does not look like a surrender, while Trump's goal is to produce a document that both Putin and the international community can accept. The overlap between these plans is where the coalition of the willing would eventually operate and maintain long-term regional stability. At the heart of the deadlock is the question of where the borders of the new Ukraine will be drawn. Russia has maintained a hardline stance, demanding that Ukrainian troops withdraw from the remaining parts of the Donbass region that they still control. Putin views these areas as legally part of the Russian Federation and refuses to entertain a ceasefire that leaves them in Kyiv's hands. Conversely, Zelenskyy is under immense domestic pressure to not cede a single inch of land. The current proposal on the table suggests a freeze of the front lines as they exist today, but this is complicated by the uneven nature of the battlefield. There are gray zones where neither side has clear control, and the status of these pockets of land remains a major sticking point. Trump has suggested that some territorial compromises may be necessary for the sake of ending the bloodshed, a sentiment that has caused anxiety in Kyiv. The map of Ukraine is being redrawn in hotel rooms and government offices, with every kilometer of land becoming a bargaining chip. The presence of international peacekeepers is seen as the only way to manage these disputed territories without triggering a new round of fighting today. Beyond the territorial disputes, the status of the Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant remains one of the most dangerous variables in the peace process. As Europe's largest nuclear facility, it has been under Russian occupation for years, serving as a site of potential ecological catastrophe. Zelenskyy has made the return of the plant to Ukrainian control a non-negotiable part of his peace plan, citing the need for energy security and public safety. Russia, however, views the plant as a strategic asset and a symbol of its permanence in the region. There are reports that a compromise is being discussed where the plant would be managed by an international body under the coalition of the willing framework. This would involve technical experts and security personnel from neutral nations, ensuring the plant's safety while its energy output is shared or diverted. Trump has reportedly expressed interest in this third-way solution as it avoids a total win-lose scenario. However, the technicalities of demilitarizing a nuclear site in a war zone are unprecedented. If the plant is not secured, any ceasefire would be inherently unstable, as the threat of a radiation leak would hang over the entire continent like a dark shadow. Even as the rhetoric of peace intensifies, the reality on the ground remains brutally violent. In a clear signal to both Kyiv and Washington, Russia recently moved nuclear-capable Oreshnik missiles into Belarus. This deployment serves as a reminder of Moscow's ultimate leverage and its willingness to escalate to the highest levels if the peace terms are not to its liking. Simultaneously, Russian drone and missile strikes have continued to batter Ukrainian cities like Odessa, targeting energy grids and port infrastructure. This talk-and-fight strategy is designed to pressure Zelenskyy into concessions while demonstrating that Russia is not negotiating from a position of weakness. The contrast between the diplomatic optimism in Florida and the sirens in Kyiv is jarring. It highlights the risk that the peace process could be overtaken by a sudden military escalation. Trump has warned that continued Russian aggression could force his hand, potentially leading to increased military support rather than the withdrawal he desires. The shadow of the Oreshnik missiles looms over every meeting, a silent participant in the negotiations. The world is witnessing a race between the signing of a document and the launch of more devastating weaponry by the Russian side. As winter deepens, the humanitarian situation in Ukraine has become a critical factor in the timing of the peace deal. Russia's systematic destruction of the Ukrainian power grid has left millions without reliable heating, water, or electricity. This creates a ticking clock for Zelenskyy, who must balance the long-term sovereignty of his nation against the immediate survival of his people. The peace negotiations are now discussing a massive Marshall Plan-style reconstruction effort, funded by international partners and potentially frozen Russian assets. Trump has emphasized that Ukraine's economic recovery is linked to its willingness to reach a settlement. The prospect of American investment and the restoration of energy exports is a powerful carrot being dangled before the Ukrainian leadership. However, the scale of the damage means that even if a ceasefire is signed tomorrow, the recovery will take decades. The humanitarian crisis provides the moral urgency for the coalition of the willing to enter the country, not just as soldiers, but as providers of essential services and infrastructure support. For many ordinary Ukrainians, the abstract debates over true presence and territorial lines are secondary to the simple need for warmth, food, and a return to a life without constant aerial bombardment. The clock is ticking toward a series of pivotal dates in early January 2026 that will determine the fate of the region. The Kyiv summit on January 3rd will bring together the core members of the Coalition of the Willing to finalize the logistics of troop deployments and security guarantees. This will be followed by a high-level meeting in France on January 6th, where the broader European leadership will weigh in on the Trump-Zelenskyy framework. These dates represent a now-or-never moment for the peace process. If a deal is not reached by mid-January, there's a significant risk that the conflict will enter a new, even more destructive phase. The stakes extend far beyond the borders of Ukraine. They involve the future of the NATO alliance, the stability of the global energy market, and the precedent for how international borders are defended. Trump's legacy as a deal-maker and Zelensky's survival as a leader are both on the line. As the world moves into the new year, the hope for peace is tempered by the reality of the immense obstacles that remain. The coming days will reveal whether diplomacy can overcome years of animosity or if the cycle of violence will continue to spin out of control forever.